system to restrict the federal government from creating these laws to prevent it. So understanding how this breakdown happened is very important. If we look back to the 19th Amendment, the prohibition of alcohol, we find that the federal government said, you know, we want to, in 1919, they want to prohibit alcohol across the United States. So they had to propose an amendment. It was not a power that was granted in the Constitution. They proposed an amendment, they got it through Congress and the Senate, and they got it ratified by the states. Today, they're prohibiting drugs. Now, it doesn't matter whether you agree or disagree with the cause. There was never a ratified amendment for the prohibition of drugs. So, how did they do that? Well, when you look back to, we were warned in 1788 that the Constitution by a judiciary is very dangerous because they could extend the limits of the general government gradually, by one case at a time, increase the powers of the federal government. So the Senate was in place to prevent this kind of thing from happening, so that it didn't even reach the judicial branch. The states appointed senators, and the Senate was there to safeguard our freedoms and prevent it. So what happened is the people of 1913 forgot about the balance of power. We don't just have a balance between the judicial, the legislative, and the executive. We have a vertical balance of power between the state and the federal government. That balance of power was disrupted. So there's no longer any mechanism in the federal government to protect us. And they write whatever laws they want, and then they wait until the judicial branch decides whether it's cool or not. And the Senate has the power to remove any judges that are not good. But they don't exercise that power because they represent the federal government. Back before so in 1942, there was a Supreme Court case that a farmer was growing wheat on one part of his farm, and he wanted to use that to feed the livestock on another part of his farm. The federal government came in and said, well, you can't do that. And they said, well, why? The Supreme Court justified the federal government coming in and telling this man he has to buy wheat from the open market because it might affect the price of interstate wheat. Okay, that really is not commerce in between the states. The Commerce Clause clearly states the federal government can regulate commerce with foreign nations, between the several states, and the Indian tribes. It does not say you can regulate anything that might might affect something that happens somewhere else. So, that being said, how do we fight that? Back before the 17th Amendment, the states would have stood up and said, no, you need to get those judges out of there. They would have demanded that their senators recall those judges and get them out, and they would have replaced them. But we can't do that anymore. Who among us has the ability to go and talk to your senators? I mean, who here actually goes and talks to their senators? In person. Okay, how many of them are actually legislators? For the common man, talking to your senator is very, very difficult. You usually end up talking to somebody in the office that later filters the message to them. The state's lost its voice, okay? And people today, we heard a lot in the last election, people were saying, we want to take our country back. Well, who do we want to take our country back from? And that's really the fundamental question that we all find ourselves facing. We've tried through elections to get people into the federal government who understand that they need to follow the Constitution. But the power of corruption in the federal government is greater than our ability to pick people who would follow the Constitution. They get there and the corruption is too much, and they end up falling in with the crowd that has all the money. So nullification ends up as the last remedy we have. We can't go to our states anymore and ask them, hey, you know, you need to get the, you need to recall our senators. We need to put some people in there who are going to follow the law. No, that doesn't happen anymore. So one of the problems that we face as people who want to return to the rule of law is we need to expand our numbers. We need to talk to people. We need to convince people from the other side. And you know, right now it's more right-wing ideology people that are into nullification because we have left-wing people in the federal government. As it was pointed out earlier, when the right wing was in the federal government, well, left people were nullified. We need to break through that barrier of hypocrisy. And we need to bring people to think of issues not as a federal issue, but as a state issue. Even Rand Paul was talking about abortion at one point and said, well, it's a state issue, and he had to retreat on it at some point because there was a lot of people saying he's for abortion because he thinks it's a state issue. Well, no, it is a state issue. There was no amendment saying that the federal government had that power. Anyway, so when you're talking to your friends and your neighbors, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and a lot of people will get stuck in talking about should we have charity, should we not have charity, and the argument gets derailed along left and right line ideology. And so you need to be able to bring them back to the federal-state argument and leave the social issues out of it. And one of the best ways to do that, I have socialists at my work that I agree with on a lot of things. I'm very much libertarian in my philosophy. But we agree that it's a state issue as to whether or not people should get help from the government. I tell them I think every state who wants to have social programs should have social programs because it's not banned in the Constitution. They have that authority. But at the federal level, it's not in the Constitution. It's been, well, if you've been following, they've been changing the definition of the words of the Constitution through the judiciary, and that's what's got to stop. But we have no tools now. The 16th Amendment came along and gave the federal government the power to tax people individually. The federal government takes that tax money and then gives it back to the states, but they attach strings to it. And they say, for example, New Hampshire in 2005 had about $6 billion in revenue. The federal government took about $10 billion from the people. They turned right around and said, we'll give you $8.5 billion to run all these social programs, but in order to get that money, you need to spend half of your own revenue on these programs we tell you to. So out of the total 16 billion taxes taken from New Hampshire, only 3 billion of it was controlled by the state. The other 13 billion was all controlled by the federal government. Well, we just saw recently, so this is how they're usurping our authority. This is how they're taking control. We saw recently in Montana, the governor mentioned, I'm sorry, it wasn't Montana. One of the governors with the nullification bill said, well, we're not going to do that because we're going to lose funding. We're going to lose federal funding. The struggle that we have to get states to nullify things is getting them to say, hey, you know, maybe we don't need that money. And this is the struggle we're against. We're fighting the 17th Amendment. We no longer have any representation in the federal government for sovereignty of the states. The 16th Amendment, we're fighting because they use that purse string to control our own representatives. It's turned our government upside down, where the federal government now collects all of the money and comes back and tells us what we're going to do with it. And if we don't obey, well, they take away the money. And they get people addicted to programs and spending. And so we're facing a really immense problem.
Just briefly explain what the 17th Amendment is.
Yeah. Oh, Right. Okay. So what happened is originally the senators were appointed by the legislatures of every state. So at a certain point, back in 1913, the population decided we need more democracy. So democracy is great. Everybody gets to pitch in on the government and decide what's going to happen. But the problem is that democracies were tried back in the early Greek city-states, and every one of them failed. Okay, they failed because it only takes 51% of the population to decide to take anything from the other 49%. So when the founders created the structure of the government, they decided that they needed to have a branch that would be a check for that, and that's the Senate. When the people decided that, and the difference between a democracy and a republic is that a republic has a constitution of laws that has to be changed by a supermajority, by 2/3. When the people decided to take the representation of the states away, the 17th Amendment provided a direct election for the senators instead of the senators representing the states. They moved us closer to a democracy. Okay? Democracies are an unstable government. We see it today. They violate the Constitution any way they want. They want to regulate garage sales. They want to regulate what kind of food our children can eat. These aren't interstate commerce acts. These are the acts of a lawless democracy just making the rules up as they go. So that 17th Amendment knocked out a critical balance of power between the states and the federal government. There's not a lot that we can do about that now. There's a lot of people who, you talk about the 17th Amendment, and they're like, oh, what, you're against democracy? You don't want me to have a voice? No, we're starting to realize as a people that the states protect us. They have, it's like collective bargaining. We can get together as a state and say, no, we're going to stand up to the federal government. But as individuals, what can we do to stand up to the federal government? We're just, you know, one person. But as the state has the power of law. The state can actually interpose itself in between an overreaching federal government and the people. So that was the importance of the 17th Amendment. The 16th Amendment took the power of the purse. And we all know that money is power. And right now they funnel it all through the halls of Congress and the federal government. So the array of power against us is dramatic. And I'll go ahead and leave off on that note. The next, I've run out of time. So anyway, what we need to do is we need to make sure that when we're in our own circles of friends, that we start to educate them as to what's gone wrong and how we can fix that.